Hey, everybody. Good
We're
to see you,
back.
Destiny. How are you?
I'm doing great, Lee. How are you?
I'm good. I will admit, and we're going to put this out there positive energy. The Nashville area where I'm at, we're having some storms. Actually, a big part of the South has had some very awful storms. There was a tornado in Georgia, there was a lot of stuff happening in Mississippi. Luckily, we were okay with the first go round, and now we are going to get the second round here in the next few hours. And so, sending prayers to people who are in that. And Emily, we hope that Emily joins us tonight, but Emily also is in this area and may or may not be able to get on. So we'll send out positive energy there, and hopefully she can join us later. But yeah,
Yeah,
doing all right. Hopefully everything will be okay.
yeah. Sending positive energy to you too, Lee. And yeah, I hope that everything is well and you stay safe. And if you need to leave, we will shut this down for you to stay safe.
Yes. So disclaimer out there, we will shut it down if I hear the it's time to get into your safe spot. So yeah, we are excited for this show tonight about purity culture, and it's something that we need to talk about because we don't talk about it enough. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm very excited, especially as a church.
yes, keeping it real tonight, and we're excited to welcome our guest. Linda K. Klein. Is that your Klein is your last name
Yes.
pronounced right, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, welcome to the show. We're so excited that you're here.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Yeah. I mean, hopefully it's going to be a great show and we won't all be terrified when things suddenly shut down. We're
Yes.
like, where is Lee?
Yeah, I will make sure everyone knows I am safe.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we have our safe spot that we always
And
go to.
Emily
So
too. Yeah.
but we are excited to have you here. So yeah, we'll just invite you to introduce yourself and tell us a little
Yeah.
about your work.
Sure. So my name is Linda, Linda K. Klein, and I am invited on probably primarily as the author of the book Pure, and the subtitle, which says a lot, so I'll go ahead and say that very long subtitle, is Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. And that book came out a couple of years ago, but since that book has come out, I've been doing a ton more related to purity culture because the response that I've received since the book has come out has been utterly and absolutely overwhelming. You know, we were talking before the call about how it's actually not, you know, my subtitle's a little misleading. It's not just evangelicals who have experienced purity culture. It's not just women.
Uh-oh. I think we might have lost her. You're muted, Lee.
Linda's frozen for a second. Well, let's see. While we're figuring that out, I'm going to pop up the title of the book. Yeah, and we'll figure out the connection before. Hopefully, we'll figure that out in a little bit. But yeah, take a look at the book. It is a good one. And Destiny, I wonder, were you raised in any kind of purity culture-ness?
Yeah, I was gonna say, Lee, before we like dive deep into like maybe our own personal stories, like for people who are watching who might okay, good. Yay!
You're back.
Sorry.
That's
It's
fine.
okay.
We popped up the title of the book just because so people can see it.
Yeah. Thank you.
So continue. But we were about to get into God knows what. So glad
Right.
for that.
Right. Yeah. So I was about to say it's so much bigger than evangelical Christianity, or really more specifically, white American evangelical Christianity, which is the sort of the the birthplace of the purity movement, but the impacts go way beyond it, and so much bigger than young women, and also that sort of phrase and how I broke free. It's so much bigger than me. I've been doing interviews for 16 years with people who were raised in evangelical Christian churches during the purity movement that I referenced before, which spurred a purity industry, which you all may have seen: purity rings, purity pledges, purity balls, purity curricula, purity pop music, purity, you name it, mugs, keychains, underwear. And yeah, no, for real. And so anyway, so it's so much bigger than that. And so I these days do a lot of work to build community among the many, many more people who have been impacted than myself and then the community within which I was raised. I run a nonprofit called Break Free Together, in many ways kind of a response to the title, How I Broke Free. It's really, not true. We broke free together, in which I help people to find one another and really begin to do that unpacking as a collective, so we're not so isolated and alone, particularly those of us who feel kind of pushed out of our religious communities or our families because we're talking about some of these issues. And I also do coaching with people one-on-one and in groups, and we kind of dig in deep in all of these themes. So it's really become kind of my whole life. I started out just as me, a person who grew up in it, terrified, feeling fear, feeling anxiety, feeling shame, feeling alone, feeling broken, feeling like I would never, ever be able to be a healthy person or have a healthy relationship. And then whispering to some of my childhood friends from the church some of the things that were happening to me. And it has built and built and built and built over time. Never could have anticipated that we would be here as a culture, finally talking about these things that when I was first talking about them in the early days, I felt like I was like an investigative reporter. Like there was no information about any of it. All I knew was, the book of my lived experience and the lived experience of the people who I was meeting.
Yeah, thank you, Linda, for that. And before we dive too deep into the book and your experience and a little bit about what we've been seeing, not only in the church but the secular world, what is purity culture for those who might be watching, who might think they know, but can you just give maybe a generic or a baseline or a broad definition or explanation of what purity culture is?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, when people say purity culture, they're usually referencing the purity movement, what I would call the purity movement. So they're referencing a culture that came out of this white American evangelical Christian church, right? That is known for a number of qualities that I'll go through. But what I want to say is these qualities are actually found in any number of places, right? So I personally think of purity culture as something much larger than that movement. I'll name some of the qualities, and you can probably name lots of different communities that adhere to them. Certainly, there is a very strong gender expectations. Gender is on a strict binary. That binary is deeply stereotypical, and it's a hierarchy. So men are expected to be these hyper masculine, manly men, the leaders, particularly of the church and the home. Women are expected to be hyper feminine, cheerleaders for the men in their lives, supporters, and followers, essentially. And under this gender binary are very strict and very different sexual expectations. Those sexual expectations look like total non-sexuality for everyone, total non-sexuality before marriage, and hyper sexuality after marriage. And of course, when I say marriage, I'm talking about a heterosexual cisgender marriage bed, right? But that's kind of the baseline for everyone. But there's also at the same time in this male category, this expectation that men are going to struggle with that, because part of their hyper masculine, manly man stuff is that they're sexual beasts who can barely contain themselves. And if they just see a little bit of skin, they're going to fall all over themselves and have no ability to control themselves. So there's almost an expectation that that struggle will be there with men. And it's at once encouraged and discouraged, and you're told to have it but control it. It's kind of dichotomy, right? Whereas with women, the message is that, you are your sexuality, right? You are pure or you are impure. It's not about what you do the way it is with men. You might masturbate. That's a thing that you did. But with women, masturbation changes who you are in purity culture. You go from to use one of the many object lessons, from an unchewed piece of gum to a chewed up piece of gum, or, whatever it is, right? And you can lose, if you're a woman or a girl, your so-called purity, not only by your own sexual thoughts and feelings and choices, but by inspiring, quote unquote, sexual thoughts and feelings and choices in men, right? By not being modest enough or being perceived as flirting or whatever the case may be. So the reason I kind of start with gender is because even though when we talk about purity culture, people often jump straight to sex and sexuality, it's actually not, I don't think it makes sense to start there, because the rules are so different. And at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is a patriarchal system that also erases members of the LGBTQIA community, that is rooted in white supremacist thought and culture, that is deeply colonial, all kinds of other things. But, so it's hard to really wrap it up, which is why I'm giving such a long answer. But, think about what I just said. We could say a very similar, we could see a very similar set of rules and expectations in other religious communities as well, in some secular cultures, some secular families. So in my personal opinion, purity culture is actually a much larger conversation than the purity movement.
And I'm glad you brought up, and one of the reasons why we really wanted to have a show focused on this, it was kind of a response to the shooting and the killing of a multitude of Asian women in Atlanta, by someone who was raised in this type of culture, and was not necessarily talked about enough, and was also used as an excuse to kill and murder these women. And so it's one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about this more, because we saw, what can happen because of that. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, because it does manifest itself in so many different ways. It's very impactful.
Yeah, I will just say, from the very first second that I heard about that news story, from the moment that I heard him say, or I heard it be reported that he had said that the women he murdered were stumbling blocks, I knew that he had grown up in purity culture. Stumbling block is a very, very common term in purity culture. And though the Bible doesn't use it this way, it is often used as a shorthand to objectify women and girls as sexual objects, who become blocks or things over which men and boys trip on their pathway to God. So here you have a culture that I've been called stumbling block more times than I can count, right? That's objectifying women just the same way that we objectify, women in secular society, but is just doing it in a different, through a different angle, through a different lens. And that lens uses biblical language and thus deifies that objectification and labels it as godly, right? One of the things that I think is so painful about purity culture is that all of these ideas, if you really think them through, to where someone could go with this, you can see the kinds of places we ended up, right? Even the horrific murder in Atlanta, right? You can see the way that thought process, not for everyone to be sure, right? Can lead us there. And this is why we have to be so careful with the messages that some people may think are innocuous. It's actually not innocuous to see women and girls as objects. It's not innocuous to see them as things over which to trip, right? And when combined with whatever else is going on in someone's head, and so on and so forth, can in fact be remarkably dangerous.
Yeah, and just to kind of expound upon that a little bit, one of my first experiences, besides, that was when I knew that purity culture, I don't want to say it's wrong per se, if that's something you believe in, you practice, and that's but what I found problematic for myself is that particularly when the church go out to other places in the world and talk to young women and girls about purity culture, and I won't name the organization, but it was affiliation with the UN, United Nations, when I was a delegate for the church, Presbyterian Church USA, and they said during one of their talks is that they tell the young women in Africa who are between the ages of 10 to 15 that they're talking to, to stay, pure. And if you have sex, you're no longer pure. No one will want you. You are dirty. You're not clean anymore. And one of, being who we are, what if one of them are rape? Well, you just tell your accuser, no, that you don't want to have sex, kick and scream. But if you're raped, you're still impure. So I just want to hear more about your experience or what you have found in your research and your talks and discussion about how the church has kind of uplifted purity culture and how it's kind of problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, and listen, I'm totally going to say that I think purity culture is a toxic theology and a toxic teaching. Making the choice not to have sex before marriage, that's not purity culture. That's your choice, right? But these theologies and these teachings, I think I just need to say, at least from my place in which I'm standing, like it's important to call a spade on this one, right? And I think the case you brought up around sexual violence is a really, really, really important conversation to have when talking about why it's just wrong, why these teachings are just wrong, right? There is an absolute erasure of sexual violence in purity culture. We do not talk about sexual violence. The same expectation that women and girls are, because we're not seen as very, particularly women and girls, not seen as very sexual. We're seen as the kind of controllers of the sexual purity of the larger culture, right? If we just do everything right, then we won't inspire any sexual thought. We won't inspire any sexual feeling. Therefore, no one will take any sexual action, including sexual violence, right? Certainly, women and girls are not the only survivors of sexual violence, and survivors of all kinds are blamed and shamed, right? But I just want to look at the way that the gender component plays out. So let's say, for example, you have somebody who is told, don't wear that sleeveless shirt, because you can see your bra strap and that makes guys think about sex. And if guys think about sex, you don't know what's going to happen, right? So you have to protect yourself and you have to protect them, protect your brothers in Christ, right? Don't be a stumbling block to them. Put on a longer sleeve shirt, right? Now, see how that logic plays out as we move forward into a sexual violence situation, right? Somebody is assaulted, somebody is raped, right? And the question so quickly becomes, what were you wearing? How did you cause it? Aren't women and girls the great keepers of purity? You must have inspired that sexual thought or that sexual feeling. You must have inspired that sexual urge. It must be your fault somehow, right? That's just one example of the way in which, this plays out. The one that you brought up, Destiny, is another really, really important example. The whole rubric of purity and impurity, does not discuss, sexual violence at all, right? You can lose your purity by inspiring sexual thoughts and feelings in others, because your purity within this culture is not yours to control, right? Your purity is defined by other people. They decide whether you're pure or not, right? Whether you feel pure or not doesn't matter. It's whether they say you're pure or not. So if you made someone else do something, yeah, you've lost your purity, right? And then there are all these horrific, stories about what happens if you lost your purity. Not only the object lessons that I mentioned, where you become a worthless object, right? I mentioned the gum. There's the Kleenex that's had snot all over it. There's the sucker where there's literally nothing left. It's been sucked down to the stick, right? There are all these, ways in which you are portrayed as truly worthless, right? But you're also told that if you were impure before marriage, which includes for many people sexual violence, whether or not that's stated outright, but due to its erasure, right, it is implicitly stated that you will struggle in your marriage bed, that you will struggle to keep your partner, right? That you will be lucky if your partner loves you and if your partner accepts you despite your deep unworthiness. These are the kinds of things that I end up talking to people about day in and day out, the ways that these messages live in our bodies, right? Whether or not we agree with them intellectually. These messages are so strong and so intense, and they're targeted toward young people, so they're deep inside many of our psyches, and not just those of us who are raised in the evangelical purity culture.
Yeah, and I wasn't necessarily raised in that, but I think it was kind of adjacent. And the queer community, I've seen it so much that there is this like when you come out, or even when you have your first intimate relationship, and there's this kind of this, I mean, the theology is you're made to feel dirty, and you're made to feel, and so I do think this whole culture, even if you're not even if you were not like really steeped in it with like purity rings and things like that, but I do think there is like a mentality of dirtiness and ickiness, and I'll go ahead and be honest, we don't talk about sex a lot, and I'm sure people who are watching this with our church may feel a little uncomfortable with it, and that's the whole point, is to really start these conversations, because we don't talk about this enough. When our denomination is nationally pretty progressive, but still sex and pure, like all of this stuff is not talked about enough. And so I want, even in the silence, it's harmful that we don't speak about it. And I know people who are watching this, they're just like, oh, they're talking about sex. Yeah, we are. And we have to.
And I mean, the thing is, when we don't talk about it, when we don't look at it, right? When we have shame around it, so we're not even really looking at it. That's, I think, part of the reason why we can't anticipate the way that some of these messages are going to impact people, because we're not looking at it deeply, right? We're like, sex, let's just try this. Oh, I hope it works, and like, I'm going to go do the dishes. But we have to have these really deep conversations. And I'm not saying that any of these teachings cause, the things that we're talking about here, but certainly, theology is powerful, and these teachings shape people's lives, right? And engender a whole number of things. And we need to really look We need to really look, really ask the questions, really get into the conversations, which requires us to kind of get past our own aversions to, talking about sex and sexuality. Oftentimes, one of the things that I find that happens is people want to talk about how do we do things differently? How do we change? Right. But they don't want to like start with themselves. Like, how do I actually pull apart all the stuff that I was raised with, that I need to dismantle, that I need to question, right? Yeah. And I don't know that it's possible for us to change as individuals if we haven't looked at what's really gone on inside of us. And I certainly don't think it's possible for us to change institutions, if we as individuals haven't really done some of that deep work. So I'm so happy that you all are having this conversation, and thank you for bravely, hosting this. And I hope that people, even if people are feeling a lot of feelings, that they can sit with those feelings and sit with the tension for a little bit and wonder about why they might be having those feelings, right?
Yeah. And we have Emily is joining us. She is here. Emily, hello.
I am here, and I apologize for my lateness. I was out running errands, and I thought, oh, it's fine. I've got lots of time to get back before 6 p.m. And then I realized, oh, they meant 6 p.m. Eastern. So here I am. I am here, and I'm so sorry to have missed whatever smart things Linda K. Klein said.
Well, we are so glad that
we thought you were caught. Yes, we thought you were caught in the storm.
Everything right now. So if in fact I drop off suddenly, it's probably because I lost power. But right now we're okay. So yeah.
If you drop off, that means I'll drop off, and it'll all drop. So, okay. But yeah, welcome. And we've just been talking along, but we also want to give you some time to introduce yourself and to talk a little bit about your book that's coming up. So we'll invite you to do that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to be with y'all here. My book just came out. Linda's book has been out for a second. I was thinking in the car on the way home, I was like, you know what, Linda, your book is the only book I've ever been asked by a woman at a bar what I'm reading. Men ask what you're reading at a bar all the time, right? Like anytime you're at a bar, a man's going to ask what you're reading. But the only time I've ever been asked by a woman what I was reading at a bar, it was when I was reading your book. Awesome. I spread the word. I was like, you got to read this. But yeah, my book just came out on March 9th. It's called Church 2, How Purity Culture Upholds Abuse and How to Find Healing. There it is. And yeah, it's about my story. It's about a lot of other people's stories. And it's about the sexualized violence that so many people experience growing up in the church and what we might consider to be able to start doing to address it. So yeah, glad to be with y'all.
Awesome. It's so good to have you join us. And it might be a good kind of a segue, like, what are we to do? Like, what is the church created this, and I'm a big believer. If you created it, it's your job to dismantle it. And what is the church? What are we to do when it comes to this?
Well, I start my book with that anecdote. I start my book with the story of Jesus and the rich young ruler. And talking about how the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, like, listen, I followed all the rules. Like, I did all the right things. Like, what am I supposed to do? And Jesus says, actually, you need to sell all your stuff. And then the text says that the rich young ruler goes away sad. And I think that is when we come to this conversation of like, what are we supposed to do about this? That's a lot of times what's happening, right? Is people are like, what are we supposed to do? And we're like, well, you can get rid of purity culture. You can do, and then people just go away sad. Because they can't do that which actually costs them. They cannot do, and when I say cost, I mean like emotional, spiritual cost. I also mean literally financial cost to this. There's so much about it that is very costly, what we're asking people to do. I want to be optimistic, but most churches are not willing to do what it takes, right? And so when we say like, what can we do? I mean, there's so many things you can do, but like full stop, very first thing, bare minimum baseline is you got to get rid of purity culture, just like completely, all of it. that's a hard sell. It's not what most people want to hear. So
yeah.
Can you, Emily, can you just share a little bit more about kind of, you mentioned like the financial gains of purity culture, and how the church benefits from that, or other ways the church benefits from that? Can you just give a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole purity culture industrial complex, right? There is the speaking circuit, there's the rings, there's the daddy-daughter dances, there's the books, there's the publishing industry, there's a whole industrial complex around this. And so, especially because of the ways that like sexual purity and sexual theology are sort of used as like a litmus test of Orthodox Christianity in a lot of circles. If you come out and say, well, maybe I don't think you have to stay abstinent until marriage, maybe I think being gay is okay, like maybe I think all these things, you can lose your job, right? If you work in the church, if you work in a Christian school, like you can lose your entire social support network. You can lose like scholarships for school. Like you can lose all kinds of things financially for coming to grips with this. And so it really is, I mean, there is, of course, obviously, the emotional and spiritual component, just like deconstruction and coming to terms with your faith and all that stuff. But there's a very, very real financial component to it as well.
And if I can add to that just briefly, for churches to do this work, there's often a loss of funders, right? Their funders tend to be older individuals who, many of whom might not parse out the difference between the kinds of things that they were raised around and what purity culture really is. And because we're not having those deep conversations, there's a really hard line about we have to keep teaching abstinence before marriage. We have to keep teaching these notions that I was raised with. Loss of funders for churches.
And you can see that there's a very real, like even just here in Nashville where I live, there's a very real example of that with Grace Point Church, where they used to be, just this enormous Franklin megachurch. Franklin is like the very rich part of Middle Tennessee, south of Nashville. Just this enormous, like sprawling megachurch campus, like gorgeous building, multi-million-dollar campus. And then they were like, actually, we affirm gay people now, and they lost everything.
Yeah.
So it's not, when we say like you might lose, it's very real. Like the threat of loss is real. And so it's almost hard to comfort people in that, to be like, no, it'll be okay if you get rid of purity culture. Well, it might not. You might actually lose a lot of things. And as you can imagine, that does not make like I said, it's a hard sell. It doesn't make a lot of churches really excited about getting on board.
Yeah.
That having been said, a lot of churches are dying right now, and particularly, if we're looking at mainline Protestant churches that are dying, this might be getting rid of purity culture and getting rid of some of these other toxic theologies might be your only way to stay alive. Yes, you will lose the bit of seats in your pews and, money coming in that's there, right? But if you really are able to stand and say, let's do something different, after that tear down, you have the opportunity, and some churches, have done a brilliant job of this, of rebuilding in a new way that actually resonates and works for people. So yes, it will cost, but it might be your only chance to stay alive.
Yeah. And I wonder about, like if we're not talking about sex, then we're not talking about purity culture. And then, I just feel like and then we're all complaining that the church is declining in membership and that the church is not relevant and all of these things. I wonder what's it going to take to really have these conversations. I was talking to someone I think it's in Florida. They have a really substantial, a church there has a really substantial sex education program, and it's wonderful. And people from all over the community come, and it's actually like the church has found its calling in that to provide positive theologies and ways of thinking about our bodies. And so I wonder, like, yeah, what are those positive theologies? What are those positive ways that the church can really like live into? I wonder if y'all have any comments on that.
You want to start?
I was gonna say, like, either one of us can start. I'll say this. I think I have shied away from doing sex positive constructive theological work because I don't think it's the answer for everyone. So for me, when I approach the work, I'm like, I am literally always centering survivors. Like, I'm always thinking about, okay, like how would survivors experience this? So for me, some survivors, right, it's great to have sex positive theological work. That's awesome. Other survivors need to never darken the doors of a church again, right? There's lots of ways to go forward from these experiences. So for me, I've sort of shied away from doing that constructive theological work just because I don't think it is necessarily the answer for everyone. But that being said, as someone who's currently getting my master's degree in theology with like a concentration in religion, gender, and sexuality, I do think it's possible. I do think it is work that is worth doing. For me, that work has to be grounded in a non-literalist, non-apologetic understanding of the Bible. So for me, and other people feel differently, but for me, whenever that work is done from like an apologetic, literalist understanding of the Bible, of like, I have to have a chapter and a verse to prove that I'm okay, right? Like, it's okay for me to marry a woman because the Bible says so. Whenever we approach it like that, we're always only going to be as smart as the last apologetic argument that we heard. And we're still using the same kind of hermeneutics or like methods of interpretation as the places where we came from. And so I find work that doesn't deal with a literalist interpretation of the Bible and yet paints this liberative theological picture with regards to sex compelling. It's not that I don't think apologetic theology is useful in any way, right? Because sometimes it really helps folks who are in these environments who are feeling like maybe God hates me, and I'm like, God doesn't hate you, like there's so there is use for it. But yeah, for me, that's what that kind of work has to be grounded in, is like a non-literalist understanding of the Bible, and understanding that like it is actually not just like acceptable for us to say no to the Bible, but like good and holy for us to say no to the Bible. Like, sometimes the Bible says stuff that like is bad and we don't need to incorporate it into our lives. And that's to empower people with that. Not to say that the Bible is useless. It's not. Like, it's a great source of like incredible information and art and creativity and people's thoughts about God and like inspiration and all of that. But yeah, that's where it is. That's where it is for me. What about you, Linda?
Yeah, well, I appreciate everything you said, and will, echo that as well. But I think maybe even another piece that I'll add to it is a values-based frame as opposed to a rules-based frame. So one of the ways that I sometimes talk about it is an endoskeleton versus an exoskeleton. So an exoskeleton is like a hard shell of rules. If you're within this, you're good. If you're outside it, you're bad. If you're in it, you're pure. If you're outside it, you're impure, et cetera, et cetera. We've had a lot of different rules in the church, right? Things have changed all the time. It wasn't so long ago that divorce, would put you on the outside of the exoskeleton, right? I mean, for some, it still does, right? But these rules change all the time. It wasn't too long ago that the idea that you could have sex with your marital partner, your heterosexual marital partner, to do anything other than procreate, would make you, bad. That was outside the exoskeleton. So the point is, the exoskeleton changes shape, but, so long as we're keeping a hard shell of rules that defines people as good or bad, we're just going to keep running into more issues, So the other option is kind of an endoskeleton model, which is values. Values that you can move and shape and show up in different circumstances and different situations and different relationships in differently. Justice in one relationship and one circumstance looks different than justice in another one, right? And similar with, respect or, caring about yourself or any number of other things. So, this is scary, like Emily Joy said, this is scary for people to say, wait, what if we let go of the rules? Like, what are people going to do? Can we trust people to really learn a set of values and to make valuable and good and wise decisions? No. Surely they can't make good decisions, right? We have to give them hard rules. They don't know how to make good decisions, right? Well, and the truth is we're not giving people much of a chance to make good decisions because we're not giving them any information. We're not having any conversation. We're not helping them to develop complex, nuanced thought on sexuality and relationship because we're telling them to lock it down, keep it under wraps, don't think about it, don't look at it, follow the rules and everything will be okay. And then as it turns out, life happens. And then all of a sudden, here we are with no guidance. The rules have been exposed as totally useless, right? We have no sense of now how to actually navigate this incredibly complex world. And we desperately need, some community. We need some ability to reflect on these things, not to be so shut down with shame that we can't even look at it ourselves, let alone bring it to somebody who we could actually maybe even talk through a circumstance with, right? So all this to say, we need to start having these conversations with people young. We need to start having conversations with people, that are open, that are not rule-based, that are value-based, so that people know that when they have questions, they can come, and that last over the course of a lifetime. Justice will always matter. It doesn't matter whether, you're a kindergartner talking about justice in your kindergarten classroom, not through a sex lens, right? Or whether you're talking about, an 80-year-old, individual who's navigating their sex life, right?
It's kind of like it sounds like you're talking about like bounded set versus like centered set thinking. And I just love that.
I don't know what that means. What does that mean?
It's kind of exactly what you're talking about. Like whether there's like a boundary around the circle or whether everybody is connected via the center. It's like the values versus the strict. This is where in and out happens. Yeah.
Yes. In that case, yes. Yeah.
So I also, I like that. And I also wonder, because I had just finished watching something about, I can't remember what it was called, but there's always the rhetoric, like you don't want to talk to kids about sex too early because it messes up their innocence and all this kinds of thing. And I wonder if that plays into this, where that kind of rhetoric to where, so many there's so many young people who are just exposed to so many things, more than what I was at any age really now. But it seems to me that now we would even more so want to have a space to have these kind of conversations with younger kids and youth. Yeah, where does that play in all of this too? That rhetoric, because I've heard that a lot in the church.
Yeah, they're still going to have questions. They're still going to, want to understand things. So basically what it ends up doing is saying, find your own teachers, kids, which is the internet. And, not always finding your best answers when you search your questions on the internet, right? It doesn't actually keep people in a place of naivete, right? It keeps people in a place of confusion and secrecy.
Well, and also I think sometimes there's a little bit of like a boogeyman phenomenon going on around this of like, we think we're going to be like showing pornography to like third graders or something as a part of sex ed. And it's like, really, okay, like it is literally never too early to start teaching children about consent. And you can start teaching children about consent when they are tiny babies before you would ever mention sex, right? Like consent is a value system. Consent is a life skill. And so you can start teaching very, very, very small children about consent, about like your body belongs to you. Other people's bodies belong to them. You don't touch other people's bodies without permission, and other people don't touch your bodies without permission. Like you don't have to hug people you don't want to hug. You don't have to do stuff you don't want to do with your body. That's the rule because it's your body, right? Like these type of things. And so, yeah, I think some of it is a little bit of a boogeyman. And also I think that we don't give children enough credit. I think that we think that children are like not people, and so they can't handle things. And I'm like, children are actually just people, right? They are people in development, but they are people. And so children deserve the same kinds of honesty and openness that everyone deserves, right? Yeah. And kind of like what Linda was saying too, it's just like if you don't give a child information that they're asking for, like they are going to find it. Children are very resilient. I had a friend who told me a story about how her child asked her what the definition of a very explicit sex term was, and she said she wouldn't tell her, and so the child turned and asked Alexa in front of her. And Alexa told her. So children are resourceful and they are resilient because they are people, right? And so, yeah, I just think, you know, when I was a child anyway, I was lied to so much about sex and about romance and about relationships. And none of it served me. Mm-hmm. And there's so many people for whom like it also did not serve them. And also, as it turns out, like when we actually look at kind of the outcomes of like abstinence only education and like all of this stuff that we've been pouring all this money into for so many years, it doesn't actually work. All of this shaming and all of this lying that we do to children at best delays the onset of sexual activity by less than a year. When you look at the average of when teenagers have their first sexual encounter, teenagers who have been through abstinence education tend to have it just a few months later than teenagers who have not had that education, but they use less protection. They have more unintended pregnancy and more STIs. So it doesn't actually work. And so I think that's ultimately when I think about like, what do we talk to children about? Well, like, is what you're talking to children about now working? No, the answer is no. So something else besides that, because what you're doing is not working.
Emily Jo, I'm curious what you think about the Our Whole Lives OWL curriculum.
I've had a lot of people who have given me like glowing reviews about it. I have not personally flipped through every page of that curriculum. My fiance has the adolescent book on the bookshelf. So and it looks great to me. When
it's a 250 page or something like that curriculum, to be clear.
I was like, this is amazing that this is religious. I don't know. I think there should be more of it. Like, you know, it's weird to me that we don't talk about it more in church. And people are like, you don't talk about that kind of stuff in church. But I'm like, we probably should though. Because if the church is supposed to be this place that's like adding to society and like a net force for good in society, then we have to talk about sex.
Yeah. So for folks who are church leaders who are interested in doing something different, the Our Whole Lives model, which is OWL is kind of the acronym that it's known for, is a values-based model. And so you would be teaching young people these values long before they are developmentally ready for you to talk to them about sex. You're not going to talk to them about sex. You're going to talk to them about values, right? And how they should navigate friendships and how they should navigate family, you know, and then those same values and the model of actually using values to talk through real life situations grows with time, so that as the curriculum goes on and you get to adolescence, you know, now these thought processes that they've developed and these ways of trusting self and our own ability to be able to navigate in an ethical, way starts to show up, you know, in conversations around sexuality when we're ready. So I like the curriculum because it goes from very, very young to really end of life, you know, and I think that we really are talking about our whole lives, and that's, why would we not? Right? Why do we think that sexuality is a different conversation somehow? That it's a conversation that, only exists in a particular little one conversation that you're going to have with somebody, like the sex talk, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, so that might be a model for people to check out. I wanted to get your thoughts on it too, and see what you thought about it as somebody who's, been really digging into these issues. But I really do like it.
Yeah, I've had a bit of exposure to it. When I was at I went to a conference, a sex conference that was put on by the Alliance of Baptists like 2 or 3 years ago, and they had a breakout session on our whole lives. And we've got the adolescent sexuality book, and yeah, everything that I've seen about it before is really great. And I really appreciate how it goes from like infancy up to like older adulthood. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, oh, how do we talk about sex? And what we mean is like, how do we tell 13-year-olds how biological procreation occurs? And I'm like, it's so much bigger and broader than that.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming up on time. And I think the best way to close may be if I would wonder if people are a part of this culture and are having a rough time or are deep in it. And I don't know, because I know a lot of people who are, and I wonder what you would say to them as a close, because I know there are a lot of people who are struggling in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I think, so much of this is there's all these resources, right? There's all these books. There's all these things you can read and avail yourself of. For me, my exit out of purity culture was not about getting more information, although the information is always helpful. But it was in the most evangelical sense, like a conversion moment, right? It's a light bulb. It's an experience. And I think that's what's hard about it. It's scary, right? Because you stand on the edge of everything that you've ever known. And you're like, I've been told if I step over this threshold, I'm a sinner. I'm going to hell, like all this stuff. But it's not true. But in some senses, you have to like experience the falsehood of it in order to get it, right? You have to step over the threshold, and then the trap door to hell doesn't open up, and you're like, oh God, okay, I'm still here. Yes, everything's fine. That was a lie. Like all this stuff, and so it's not so much about like read this book or like avail yourself of this resource, even though there's a ton and they're great, right? You should read Linda's book. You should read my book. Like you should read Our Whole Lives. These are all great things. But so much of it is about connecting to that inner sense of self, to that inner sense of values, and like making decisions based on that, not based on what other people are telling you that you have to do, not based on what, your church's interpretation of the Bible is, your parents' interpretation, like any of this stuff, but based on you and your connection to your values, because that's the only way it's really going to stick, right? You are never going to make a change in your life if it's external, if it's someone else telling you this is what you have to do. It has to come from inside. And so yeah, that's what but it's scary, right? So like the answer is like, you are brave. You are brave and you can do it. I don't want to say it's going to be okay, right? Because we talked about this when I first popped on. You might lose stuff. You might lose things. You might lose people. You might lose relationships. But like you are brave and you have the capacity inside of yourself to determine your values and to then take those values and have that conversion moment, have that moment of like, I feel myself free.
Yeah. Yeah. And I first of all, just want to say, I totally agree that it's not a resources answer, and all these resources are, moments in time, right? They're all developing, they're all figuring themselves out. None of them are, going to have all the answers, right? None of them are going to be complete, right? So it's about starting the journey, right? And for me, the big thing that I keep telling people over and over and over again, and I love the "you are brave," right? So that, hold on to that, and then you are not alone. You are so not alone, right? Whatever you are going through, I can't even tell you. You know, when I first left evangelicalism, before I started kind of trying to search out the others, yeah, I was taking pregnancy tests, though I wasn't having sex, because I was so terrified that, you know, I would become pregnant.
We have never talked about this, but I also did that.
You did? Oh yeah, we definitely need to have another conversation. Well, and so, and that's exactly what I'm trying to say. Like, I thought, surely I am the only person who has ever done this. Actually, it's so funny. I just went down to my college area a couple of days ago, and I passed by this drugstore that I used to go to and buy pregnancy tests all the time, because it was just the only thing that would steady my breathing so I could get through the day, you know, despite the mounting anxiety that something big was going to happen, that was going to end my life, because surely some punishment has been promised, right? Even though I haven't had sex, I've been exploring enough that some punishment is coming, right? And I think through this process, I can't tell you, no matter what you're experiencing, right? Like, you are not alone. And so even before you try to seek out, you know, how to be, you know, how to reconstruct, and, you know, even before that, deconstruct, you know, before all that, like, just sort of hold the weight of the massive community that you are in.
Well, and like, that's kind of the whole point of, like, you know, I have this book, this hashtag Church Too, but like, that's based on like the hashtag Me Too, you know, Tarana Burke's Me Too movement. And like, that's the whole point. Me too. Like, you're not alone. I also went through this. I also understand, you know, like, that is the whole freaking point.
Yeah.
Is that solidarity.
Yeah.
Well, thank y'all so much for being with us. I'm going to flash up the books one more time. This is Linda's book, Pure. Go grab a coffee. And then Emily, hashtag Church Too. Go out, get it. And we're so grateful that y'all are with us to talk about something that the church should be talking about a lot. So we're very grateful for y'all to be here. Any last words, comments? No?
My heart's really full.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that we made it all the way through. And
yeah,
that
we made
there
it.
hasn't been a storm sort of outage.
It actually doesn't look bad out there right now. So, but you never know in Nashville. Never know. Could pop up. But yeah, so grateful that y'all are with us, that you've been with us. This was great. We need to have a part 2 of this just to keep it going. But yeah, join us next week. We're going to have a part 2 to Stop AAPI Hate with Irene Cho. And we will see you again, same time, same place.